Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, first of all, which is wonderful. It's really nice to be here. Thanks all for coming out this morning. I really look forward to the discussion. So this is a topic I've been thinking about for quite a long time, but I haven't really worked on that much. I mean, so the cultural intermediaries or socio-technical intermediaries, which are at the center of the discussion today, have sort of been at the periphery of a lot of my research. And I think for many people that's actually the case. Although there have been, over the last couple of years, more and more research that actually specifically focuses on this particular set of actors. And what I want to try today is building on the work I've been doing over the last couple of years on platforms and culture production to think more systematically about this particular set of actors. And also maybe question how we call them, because maybe the notion of cultural intermediary or socio-technical intermediary is not the best term to understand them. I don't have an alternative yet, but I hope we'll get there today. I do have a lot of complications around this notion. And that hopefully eventually will lead to an article. So critical feedback is very welcome. So please push back, suggest other interesting angles and so on. I love to hear those. All right, for now it's called Examining and Theorizing Cultural Intermediaries within Platform Ecosystem. The Platform Ecosystem part is really important because that sort of gives me a handle, the framework to think about this more systematically. Okay, in doing this, I built on, well, the book which was just mentioned, Platforms and Cultural Production, which I will, touch on a couple of times, especially thinking about what platforms are and how, well, what we now call cultural intermediaries are connected to them, as well as a new book I'm working on currently with David again and José van Dijk, who have written a book with a couple of years back on the Platform Society. And we are now looking into sort of relations of dependence around platforms. And we actually think that platform power has not been adequately theorized so far. That it's that the notions which have been developed are much too all-encompassing, to not really lack finesse or nuance to understand these relations. But that will be coming in, well, hopefully 2 years or so, when it's written and gone through review. All right. So this is the talk, the structure of the talk. So first, I want to think about this what I would call a process of intermediation in the platform ecosystem, in which these cultural intermediaries are embedded. And I mean, the first thing, of course, to realize is that while we call them cultural intermediaries specifically, of course, there are only one layer of intermediation in this ecosystem. There are many other layers of intermediation. These cultural intermediaries are part of this more complex process. And that's also a reason why we might want to complicate this notion of the cultural intermediary. We'll get to that in a moment. And then I would like to think about three processes which very much relate to what platforms do, in which cultural intermediaries are centrally involved, which they play a central role. And for now, I've called them sort of competition or market competition, integration, which specifically refers to infrastructural integration, and then formalization, which very much refers to platform governance and the ways in which particular sets of rules, standards, and so on are introduced. And all of them, cultural intermediaries, or what we call cultural intermediaries, are quite centrally involved. Right? So that's the idea of the talk. Okay, intermediation in the platform ecosystem. So what does this process entail, and which actors intermediate? I think, well, the first thing I think to realize, to think about this is, and to think about this sort of historically and how we think about digitization and the internet, is that initially scholars were mostly thinking about the internet and also sort of the first iteration of platforms as instruments of disintermediation. right? They disintermediate. That means removing sort of the sort of more legacy institutions that stand in between cultural producers and consumers, like, for example, legacy media organizations. And the idea was that, of course, there would be more direct connections between producers and consumers, or between prosumers, a term that was very much in vogue in the 2000s, a really problematic term. But a couple of scholars were sort of jumping on board, like Axel Bruns, Clay Shirky, Henry Jenkins. Many of them actually have, sort of gone beyond that term and have done really great and interesting research later on. And that, I mean, maybe that was an interesting moment in our thinking. But I think looking back, it's also a little bit, I think, going, not really appreciating the complex institutional contexts which are created around these digital intermediaries, which eventually we call platforms. So this is a typical example of this. Is from 2010, so relatively late, by Ritzer and Jurgensen. So Ritzer is quite a famous sociologist, George Ritzer, who argue in 2010, probably written like 2 years before that or so, in producer and consumer capitalism, so the more traditional forms of capitalism, corporations are likely to exert great control over the production and or consumption of content and goods. But, and here we get to this new phase, supposedly new phase in capitalism, prosumer capitalism, these companies are more likely, the idea, to stand back and to meddle less with the prosumers who are producing and consuming the content. The idea is more to get out of the way of the prosumers than to seek to control them. To take a specific example, YouTube does not need to control the quality of videos it hosts, and it can host as many videos as people want to upload. YouTube does not have to make many decisions about what is created besides issues relating to copyright and vulgarity. So that was kind of the state of, well, I mean, some people were already raising questions around that time, obviously, but the idea is disintermediation, right? And that's obviously not what happened. So there's many more forms of mediation, intermediation happening in the platform ecosystem than probably before that time. Maybe that's also something to discuss. Because some of what we're seeing in terms of intermediaries are actually types of companies which have been around for decades and decades, right? So talent agents, for example, have been there for a very long time. All right, so these cultural intermediaries. So media industry scholars have been kind of struck, as many of you in the room, I guess, by sort of these often small companies, individuals that broker and facilitate interactions, transactions between platforms, culture producers, audiences, but also very much so advertisers. Right? So in many cases, actually a relationship between also making sure that advertisers can come into this ecosystem. These companies and individuals have been referred to then as cultural, and you use the notion of socio-technical intermediaries. So what are they? So I pulled up, or I looked at the quote from the call, or at least the announcement of this workshop. And you talk about these, and now I'm reading from what you've written, as a multitude of intermediaries that exist between culture producers and large infrastructural platforms, thus creating an additional meso layer of socio-technical cultural intermediaries in the value chain. These intermediaries disperse technological infrastructures for production, optimizing content for a platform environment, negotiating the payment relationship between advertisers, platforms, and others. And I think in here, I would especially like to, and again, emphasize sort of the monetization side of this, because it's so incredibly crucial. And if you look at what a lot of the research about these intermediaries does, it's very much concerned about that part of this configuration. And in my book on platforms and culture production, we have an even simpler definition, which is just cultural intermediaries as a range of actors broker and facilitate culture creation, distribution, marketing, and monetization through platforms. So clearly, we haven't thought that much about it, but maybe we should think more about it. And then very concretely, if you look at the research out there, these intermediaries refer to talent agencies, analytics firms, also algorithmic experts, multi-channel networks, which were quite popular about a decade ago, influencer marketing agencies, crowdfunding sites, creator merchandising agencies, media agencies, and so on. So quite a heterogeneous set of actors. Well, now we get to the famous French philosopher sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, often referred to in this type of research, because in his 1979 book, Distinction, he proposed this notion of the cultural intermediary. Didn't actually talk that much about the cultural industries per se, but but he referred mostly to at the time, and then it's probably more like early 1970s, new occupations involving around the presentation, representation in sales, in marketing, advertising, public relations, fashion, decoration, and so on. So institutions basically involved in symbolic good, the production of symbolic goods, services, and Bourdieu writes about these, and I think he's also somewhat critical here. So need merchants, sellers of symbolic goods and services who always sell themselves as models and as guarantors of the value of their products, who sell so well because they believe in what they sell. And then the second word is maybe more important: occupations involving presentation and representation, providing symbolic goods and services in the context of a new economy whose functioning depends as much on the production of needs and consumers as on the production of goods. So that last part I think is absolutely the most important. So a sphere between production of goods and the consumption of goods. Right? So in that zone in between is about the production of needs and the production of consumers. So and then more recently, there are lots of researchers in to the field of media industries and new media who have picked up on this notion, or briefly at least refer to it, and then talk about particular types of what they then call cultural intermediaries. And these are some of the examples which I've also built on and also refer to sometimes in the rest of this talk. So Sophie Bishop, for example, talks about these self-appointed algorithmic experts on YouTube who sometimes also become celebrities. Ramon Abate talks about these multi-channel networks, which were really a hype around 2013-14. And I also will talk a little bit later on about how they become less central and why that is and how that's related really to platforms. So in 2014, Disney bought Maker Studio, which was quite an important moment, sort of recognizing that there are these intermediaries, which are quite important. And then Smith Mehta looks at talent agencies and also multi-channel networks in India. Ryan Stolt and colleagues looks at companies that connect travel influencers and destination marketing organizations. Ida Willig looks at media agencies that advise advertisers where to put their advertising budget. So I'm referring to these also to give you a sense, but also because I will refer to these studies a bit later, sort of illustrate particular points which I'm trying to make. So all of these studies build on and give empirical substance to the notion of cultural intermediary in the platform ecosystem, but what they do not do is provide a theory of how these intermediaries, kinds of intermediaries in the cultural sector are positioned in the platform ecosystem. And that's of what I'm going to try to do today. So the first move in, sort of going towards a more systematic understanding, in my mind, is really shifting the focus from specific socio-technical cultural intermediaries to layers of intermediation. So that is the first move. Layers of intermediation that can be observed in the platform ecosystem, rather than focusing on particulars sets or types of cultural intermediaries. And why layers of intermediates, of intermediation? So platforms, and that's, I think, the first important observation, and many of you are obviously aware of this, platforms, or as they've also been called, I think, especially also by some French scholars, digital intermediaries, obviously are vital layers of intermediation in their own right? So they intermediate in a variety of ways. So platforms in the culture industries intermediate between culture producers, end users, advertisers, and also these cultural intermediaries which we're talking about today. And in doing so, they deeply affect how these actors interact with each other through, all of the ways which we know, right? So community guidelines, policies, partner programs that give access to advertising revenue and data, content curation algorithms that make particular content visible, and so on. So all of these forms of ways in which these companies actually do get in the way and meddle with the so-called prosumers, which obviously they do not get out of the way of. They actually control them and shape them in minute and detailed ways. So, but then things get much more complicated, because obviously platforms are not working in isolation either, but they sit in larger ecosystem of other platforms that also intermediate. And that leads to quite complex, if we continue to use this language, stacks of intermediation. So take the example of, I've lately looked a lot into advertising, digital advertising, programmatic advertising, especially in relation to this notion of platform power. So if you look at the video advertising ecosystem, you can see a variety of different platforms that sort of are stacked on top of each other. So you have obviously the user-generated content platforms, YouTube, Facebook, which many of us have sort of looked at, but then you also have data management platforms, supply-side trade platforms. You have the auction platform, which is effectively also a platform, demand-side trade platforms, demand-side premium, and then those all sit in between advertisers and eventually audiences, right? So there's many, many layers of intermediation between them. And the socio-technical intermediaries we are interested in are somewhere in those layers of intermediation, right? So they're sitting in this complex ecosystem. And so this is what this is completely, you can't really read this, but there's a purpose to that. So this is kind of the types of ecosystems you get when you start mapping these kinds of partnerships. So these are business and data partnerships between, in this case, the particular large user-generated content platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and so on. So this is work by two of my colleagues, Fernando van der Vlist and Anne Helmond, who have scraped and mapped these connections between these major social media platforms. And they maintain, in this article, it's 2021 article, that business-to-business partners, so again, these are really the intermediaries we're also talking about, play a pivotal role through the creation of software tools, products, and services for shaping the creation, buying, modeling, measuring, and targeting of data audiences. And these kinds of partners are becoming partners through vetting and certification processes, which are very standardized, by the way, but they are checked on a number of, well, often 80 to 100 different criteria, and whether they should be well, in this network, which means if you're a partner, then you get access to data, you get access to particular forms of revenue sharing. And these are thousands and thousands, right, of these kinds of partnership around these major platforms. And so that's the reason why these kind of visualizations are almost impossible to read. Okay, so layers of intermediation. And then, so rather than focusing on particular socio-technical intermediaries, we need to understand media agencies, analytic companies, marketing brokers in these larger processes of intermediation, which there are just many layers of between production and the consumption of goods, right? Which was originally the Bourdieu sort of question. So what kind of layers are there, and what are the actors in between them, and how does that lead to particular production of needs and consumers, right? And those are many, many different layers. So, of course, that then raised the question whether this notion of socio-technical intermediary or cultural intermediary is really the best term to use. Because I would rather have a term that does not include the notion of intermediary in there. Like we refer now to platforms rather than to digital intermediaries, because I think that otherwise we're getting this really complicated set of intermediaries which are difficult to distinguish from each other. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe we do need to all refer to these as intermediaries. But for now, the more interesting question is, to me now, is how to systematically study these, let's call them now cultural intermediaries for now, that sit between platforms, advertisers, sponsors, and audiences, and of course cultural producers. And the first step in taking on this question is to consider how platforms intermediate. So that's the first, or the second step. The first step was really sort of understanding all of this as layers of intermediation, but now the question is, so how do platforms intermediate? As our socio-technical intermediaries, cultural intermediaries are positioned in ecosystems that develop around these platforms, right? So they intermediate in relation to platforms, or they complement the platform. They're platform complementers. So that brings me to this notion of platform, which we've worked on in this book on platforms and cultural production. We've tried to define it a couple of times in different publications, but we eventually arrived at this definition, which really builds on work in business studies, critical political economy, software studies. We've defined platforms, and that basically consists of three elements, which maybe are not immediately visible in this definition. So we think about them as data infrastructures that facilitate, aggregate, and monetize and govern interaction between end users, content, and service providers. So they're data infrastructures. They are also markets, right? Because they facilitate, aggregate, and monetize these interactions. And we understand them as governance frameworks. So those are the three elements which we work with in thinking about platforms, which really build on these different literatures. So as markets, as data infrastructures, and as governance frameworks. And the markets is really about facilitating, aggregating, and monetizing interactions, and which are then governed in particular ways through platforms. And governance is quite complex in these, but I'll get to that later. I mean, to make it more sort of less abstract, more concrete, you can think about YouTube as such a platform. It's a market in the sense that it aggregates and monetizes interaction between content creators, advertisers, and end users on a very large scale, largely automated. These interactions are then afforded by YouTube's data infrastructure that allows culture producer creators to seamlessly upload their content, which is quite a big feat in terms of if you think about how much data is involved there, on Google servers, and then be able to stream it worldwide by billions of people. But also it allows advertisers and others to really target particular users which are consuming those videos, right, in very, very specific ways. In thinking about these markets and infrastructures, it's very important to see that they're relatively open, right? So they are, others can upload content there in its infrastructure. Others can also, in a relatively easy fashion, monetize their content. And then, but of course, there are all sorts of forms of control, which brings me to platform governance. So YouTube sets all sorts of government mechanisms in play by controlling and standardizing these interactions by terms of service, creator guidelines, developer documentation, but also, for example, by algorithmically organizing that content. So that's a platform, right? Very concretely, those three elements. What is then not a platform? Not a platform. So there are quite a few companies in the cultural sector that often leads to, I think, sort of confusion, that are very digital, that also use algorithms that are very data-driven, but we would not necessarily call them platforms. Netflix is maybe the ultimate example of this. So just as much as the New York Times or Walt Disney, which are very data-driven, very algorithmically organized. We would not call them platform companies, but rather media and entertainment companies, precisely because they are not economically and infrastructurally open. Right? You can't go to Netflix and upload your video there and then start monetizing it. You actually need you need to be licensed by YouTube or commissioned by YouTube to produce content. So these are media companies rather than platforms. Just to get that out of the way. Okay, now we get to the three processes in which I would say these cultural intermediaries are quite centrally involved, and often they actually reinforce these kinds of mechanisms, which are mostly driven by platforms, but given particular shapes by these cultural intermediaries. And the first one is competition, or market competition. This builds obviously on business studies or political economic research that understands these platforms as multi-sided or two-sided or multi-sided markets, which is a notion that has been developed from the early 2000s onwards, also by French economists and US, mostly French, US and Japanese business scholars. So for those who are not familiar with this type of work, and very simply, if you think about sort of a traditional one-sided market relation, a movie studio, for example, producing a movie, which is subsequently licensed to movie theaters, which then exhibit it. Or think about a record company producing a record which is then sold to consumers in stores. This is the one-sided. Platforms typically constitute two-sided or multi-sided markets. They become the market. So that's why we say it's a platform market. The platform is the market. By enabling interactions between content and service providers and consumers. As you can see on this slide. These then can be considered different sides of the market. By the way, in this type of literature, often it's considered to be a direct interaction between producers and consumers. Obviously, that's something we want to complicate because it's actually very much intermediated. And then it's very important to get these different sides on board on this market. So for the puzzle for a platform company is really to get end users on board, producers on board, and in many cases advertisers on board to finance all of this, which is not self-evident, right? Sometimes we hear the stories of the huge growth of TikTok or Facebook in the past, but it's difficult. There are many more examples of failed platforms than there are of successful ones. So it's a balancing act to bring these different sides on the market. And when that succeeds, a platform becomes almost unavoidable. So when it succeeds, it's very difficult not to go through the platform, either for users who find their content there and their friends and their acquaintances and so on. So you can see that very clearly, I think, with TikTok, not only TikTok, with Twitter recently. So Twitter, many people don't want to be on Twitter anymore, but they have built up this network over the past, and they want to, give some noise to the seminar they're organizing or the conference or their new paper, and then they actually do post something on Twitter because that's where they find their large audiences. So unavoidable. And that's also true for example, news organizations. So many of them don't like Facebook very much, but they still have to work with Meta to find their audiences. And it's also true for advertisers, which sometimes can boycott platforms, but also need them to find their audiences. So strong relations of economic dependence form around these platforms. This is often understood through this notion of network effects, to which you can see here on this slide. So if TikTok or Facebook or any of these platforms have lots of end users, they become very attractive for creators, content producers, because that's where they find their audiences. And then the more content and service providers come on the platform, the more interesting it becomes for end users. And then it becomes also interesting for advertisers, which provide capital. And that those sort of moves of these different sites reinforce each other, generating sort of winner-take-all effects. And for that reason, it's often only one or two platforms dominate a particular sector. So video sharing, for example, completely dominated by Facebook, or short video by TikTok and so on. So winner-take-all, and also within platform markets. So if you look at TikTok, for example, you can see a number of creators very, very prominently visible, and then huge numbers, most who are almost invisible. So when you generate a lot of engagement, the algorithm tend to make the content and the producer very visible. Okay, so now we get to these cultural intermediaries, or socio-technical intermediaries. And what they suggest is that they actually reinforce these winner-take-all dynamics. So sometimes, well, you hear these stories of huge success by a creator, you know, in a couple of weeks, generated millions of views. But especially sustaining that success requires substantial resources. And substantial resources, in practice, actually means access to cultural intermediaries. So access and support with talent agencies, analytics firms, brand managers, marketing agencies, and so on. So to be able to continue to target particular types of users, to grow your brand, and then to be able to work with sponsors and advertisers. So it's a complicated mix, which you need to get right also as a creator. And you need these cultural intermediaries to do so. And those that succeed in doing that obviously are these huge winners, right? They stick out, and cultural intermediaries are very much sustaining that, those winner-take-all dynamics. They are also, I would say, gatekeepers. So it's not just the platform that is in a way a gatekeeper, it's also the cultural intermediary that is a gatekeeper in the competition for visibility, and also in the competition for access to advertisers. So here, this is the case of the travel influencers, studied by Ryan Stolt, which I referred to earlier, and colleagues, who sit in between, and this is a particular conference or intermediary, wonderful, which sit in between travel influencers and destination marketing organizations or destinations. And what these researchers point out is that they are in the process of vetting influencers, drafting contracts, monitoring campaigns, administering payment, and so on. So they fulfill a number of different functions, which are basically about gatekeeping. So making sure that the particular influencer is brand safe, is doing content that actually works for the destination, but also sort of weeding out those that do not meet these criteria, and then professionalizing. And we'll get to the professionalization in a moment. So gatekeeping and picking winners. So this can very clearly, I think, be seen in the news and media and entertainment industry, where so which was, and if you're studying the news industry, you are, you know that historically those was basically the prime site for advertising, right? So those were environments where you could reach the audience, which is a neutral space for ads, but also a branded environment. So if you associate with a luxury magazine, then you, as a luxury brand, you want to be, on that particular website or in the print magazine. So that's the classic model, and context there was very important. But with programmatic advertising, behavior becomes much more important, becomes disconnected from particular context, and consumers can be reached anywhere on the basis of their behavior. So much of that is about platforms, right? About platforms creating sort of this ecosystem of programmatic advertising. But cultural intermediaries also play a part in this. They're instrumental to this. So Ida Willig's research, which I talked about before, which looks at media agencies, shows that these media agencies, once they start directing advertisers towards programmatic advertising, they basically are contributing to the shift of advertising revenue, right? To away from legacy media companies towards this much more sort of distributed, decontextualized process of programmatic advertising. That basically means a massive loss of revenue for news organization, media organizations. So that's competition. Right? So picking winners, gatekeeping, intensifying competition. Then integration. So here we get to the infrastructural part of this. So infrastructural integration. So platforms such as TikTok, Facebook, YouTube provide infrastructural affordances to cultural producers, sponsors, advertisers to work through the platform, to be able to work through the platform. So I say infrastructure relatively open, but there are lots of resources that make it open. And this has been, we theorized through this notion of boundary resources. That's not our term, but it comes from business studies. This infrastructural support is then understood through this notion. And that refers to, for example, partner programs, community guidelines, application programming interfaces, software development kits, and so on, that enable these third parties to build on and offer their services through the platform. So either when it's advertising or content, doesn't matter. These are the boundary resources to do that through. And that, in most cases, especially refers to data infrastructures. Again, news organizations, when they're connecting to users online, they need to know where users are, who they are, what their interests are, just as much as advertisers need to know those things, right? They need to be able to sort of track these types of users. And to gain these insights, they depend on data, which is then derived, which can be derived from their own apps or news sites, but that's quite limited. So it's especially derived from platforms. And then Facebook and Google have been also quite central to sort of pushing that type of data as sort of a metric to consider in terms of thinking about audiences. That means then infrastructure integrating with the platform. And here again, we see, of course, cultural intermediaries coming in very, very centrally, because I would say that probably the datafication, especially of, for example, the news sector, is mostly being done through these cultural intermediaries, not necessarily directly from the platform, because the tools provided by the platforms are quite generic, whereas the types of sort of services provided by, for example, Chartbeat are very, very specific. They provide interfaces to be able to trace your content from minute to minute and combine also data from different platforms, so not just Facebook, but a wide variety of platforms to help track user engagement with content. And then there have been quite a few of these which have been prominent, like NewsWhip, Outbrain, Engage, CrowdTangle, which has been bought, I think, by Facebook and now discontinued. So these things come and go also over time, and they help target then these users. So, but they very much contribute then to this process of infrastructural integration, right, of culture producers with platforms. And here, I just want to briefly return to these multi-channel platforms, which I mentioned before. They were hype in 2013 and 14, and they tried to do almost everything for creators, right? So Maker Studio is an example of that, or an Machinima, and there are quite a few others. They help creators to generate revenue, work with the boundary resources, put up partner management agreements, help with monetization, sales, audience development, and so on. So basically, they help with integration with platform infrastructures. But here, I think it's kind of interesting, and I've alluded to this a couple of times. These cultural intermediaries are often quite precarious. They sit in a precarious position because they're so much part and parcel of these platform ecosystems, right? So the moment the platform changes, the whole equation for the intermediary also changes. And this is kind of a theme which we've been kind of interested in more generally in relation to platforms. So we've thought about this especially from the perspective of cultural intermediaries, so cultural producers, which constantly have to adapt to platform evolution. And platforms constantly change, right? They change the algorithms, they change the access to the APIs, the SDKs, which constantly means that these cultural producers have to adapt. But it also means that these cultural intermediaries or socio-technical intermediaries have to adapt as well. So they're precarious. And these multi-channel networks are a prime example of this. So they grew around, especially around YouTube, but the moment YouTube started to open up monetization in 2014 to virtually all larger platforms, they basically took the reason of existence away from these multi-channel networks. So in one go, they were kind of largely put out of business. They still exist, but they've really lost a lot of their value. And this can be seen everywhere. So this is Charlie D'Amelio, who are not familiar with the latest online trends. We're not the latest, it's already for a couple of years. So successful creators like Charlie find sponsorship deals outside the platform with the help of cultural intermediaries like marketing agencies, right? So this is a super successful example, but there are many more not so well known, but they needed, at least in TikTok, these cultural intermediaries to make those kinds of deals. And again, we can see the same thing happening. The platform starts to provide this type of service itself, right? So TikTok launched 2019 the Creator Marketplace, drawing sponsorships on the platform, allowing brands and agencies to connect with over 800,000 qualified creators. They call them qualified creators. And then effectively cutting out the middleman. And the middleman being the kind of cultural intermediaries we're interested in. So this then, a couple of dynamics here in terms of infrastructure integration, cultural intermediary support, cultural producers, advertisers, and other third parties to work with and through platform infrastructures. Once these actors adopt these resources, they develop infrastructural dependence. They're infrastructurally captured in a way by the platform. This process of infrastructural integration can also undercut the position of these socio-technical intermediaries, which are effectively quite precarious when the platform decides to further open its boundaries or integrate particular intermediary resources in its infrastructure. Then the last dynamic, also I think, okay, yeah? Okay, perfect. So formalization, which is closely connected to platform governance, and formalization then refers to the process in which explicit rules, regulations, policies, and procedures govern cultural production. So a process of formalization. And this, I think this relation between informality and formality is very interesting in the platform ecosystem, because both are happening, right? Lots of sort of informal forms of production and consumption, prosumption, as they were initially called, take shape, but also lots of ways in which those practices are being formalized. And here we're especially interested in the formalization part. They're drawing into, so creators are drawn into a process of formalization to be able to make some money out of the stuff they do, right? And to to work with, for example, tourist destinations to go back to the tourist example, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, so in the book, we think about platform governance through 3 different modes. So it falls apart in a variety of strategies. And the first mode we call regulation, and that's a mode of governance which often has not gotten a lot of attention, but we think is very important. And that's about setting of standards, guidelines, and policies. So it's very much governance through infrastructure or governance through boundary resources. It hasn't gotten that much, at least scholarly attention. So think, for example, about TikTok and its ad sharing scheme Pulse as a form of this type of governance, setting the threshold to participate in this type of monetization at 100,000 followers. So all of these platforms have now these kind of thresholds in place, also to prohibit the types of spam-producing creators to actually start making money through these platforms. So they want to have particular thresholds. That's a form of standardization. And cultural intermediaries like Wonderful, which I talked about before in the travel sector, help influencers then to professionalize and to follow these kinds of standards or meet these kinds of standards, guidelines, and policies, and to then work with the money side or the resource side of things through online courses, ebooks, travel conferences. They teach influencers that it's their responsibility to be professional, right? To create media kits, to highlight also the audience demographics, and to calculate engagement, which then allows them to work with destination marketing organizations. So basically, I mean, in practice, a particular luxurious resort wants to draw a specific influencer to, give publicity to their location, to the destination, but they want to make sure that they have someone that's going to do a good job, right? That will generate enough engagement with a particular demographic which is interesting for that destination. So the intermediary, like Wonderful, allows these influencers to meet those criteria, sort of trains them to meet those criteria. Yeah, so the second mode of governance is what we call curation, which is in many cases really the algorithmic organization of content on the platform. So it's categorization, ordering of content and services on the platform. And that's largely automated. And in doing so, they establish regimes of visibility. And so Taina Bücher, for example, has done lots of work around this notion of regimes of visibility. What is relevant and what's not relevant. Yeah, there are lots of interesting complications to all of this, but I can't go into that. But again, here, these cultural intermediaries assist creators in engaging with platform curation. So here, for example, these types of algorithmic experts, which Sophie Bishop has studied, are interesting, right? They are very similar to these search engine optimizers. They sell kind of the insurance of visibility. They help creators, whether they do or not is not the question right now, but at least they promise to help creators to become very visible through these algorithmically organized ecologies. So Bishop actually says, or observes that these kind of experts often present themselves as adversaries of platforms, that they are sort of going against, that they're revealing the secret sauce to the platform. But she emphasizes that ultimately they end up emphasizing the organizational strategies and business models of these platforms. So that's sort of the red thread for all of this, right? Is that these cultural intermediaries sort of reinforce the logics of these platforms. And then the final one is moderation as a governance strategy by platforms, which refers to pre-screening, rejecting, removing, sequestering, banning, downgrading, and demonetizing of content and accounts by platforms. That type of, in all of these forms of moderation or governance are quite difficult. Platforms have a really hard time doing this right. So they've gone lots of times really wrong also, removing content that shouldn't be removed, but also leaving content that should actually be removed or not become very visible. But anyway, again, cultural intermediaries are part and parcel of this. So I talked about before about vetting particular types of influencers to make sure that they're brand safe, that that the brand or the destination can rely on content and influencers which they're connected that work well with their brands. And of course, reinforcing basically the governance of the platform, whether it's on YouTube, TikTok, or Facebook. All right, and then the conclusion. Okay, so what I hope you take away from this is that first of all, the first move, right, is that cultural or socio-technical intermediaries should not be seen in isolation, right? Well, of course, you can do case studies on particular cultural intermediaries and describe what they're doing, but always be aware that they're fundamentally embedded in a platform ecosystem where there are many, many layers of intermediation, in which there maybe could be considered as one layer of intermediation. So there are multiple layers of intermediation between production and consumption, and platforms themselves constitute complex intermediaries in their own right. And that also then means that the cultural intermediaries need to be studied in relation to what platforms do, right? So in relation to what platforms do and in relation to what advertisers expect, whether they're destinations or brands and so on. So they have to meet those two sides. This can be done along the dimensions of the platform, as we've suggested, so of markets, infrastructure, and governance, which generate processes in which cultural intermediaries play an important role. So winner-take-all competition, infrastructural integration, and formalization. And finally, in all of this, these cultural intermediaries are precarious. Well, almost everything in the platform ecosystem is precarious. So all of it is subject to constant change. Even the platforms themselves are to some extent precarious, even though if they succeed in getting all of the different sides on board, they've become unavoidable, but they're constantly running the risk of becoming irrelevant to some extent. Thank you very much.